Muammar Gaddafi was born on June 7, 1942 near the city of Sirte in western Libya. He came from a humble Bedouin family belonging to the small Kadhadfa tribe, which had little influence in Libyan society at the time. His father worked as a shepherd, and the family lived in a tent in the desert, moving according to the needs of their livestock. Gaddafi grew up experiencing poverty, but he also absorbed the traditions of tribal life, which placed high value on loyalty, family honor, and independence. The harsh desert environment played a role in shaping his determination and his resilience from an early age. As a child, he attended a local Islamic elementary school where he memorized parts of the Quran and learned basic Arabic grammar. He later studied in secondary schools in Sava, a town in southern Libya. At this time, Libya was ruled by King Idris I, who had been installed with Western support following the end of Italian colonial rule and the discovery of oil in Libya. Young Gaddafi became disillusioned with the monarchy, regarding it as corrupt, weak, and too dependent on the West, especially Britain and the United States. He also grew increasingly inspired by the ideas of Arab nationalism, particularly those of Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, who called for the unity of Arab nations against Western imperialism and Zionism. In 1961, Gaddafi entered the Royal Military Academy in Benghazi, where he formed a secret group of fellow young officers who shared his revolutionary ideas. These officers, inspired by Nasser, wanted to overthrow King Idris and replace his monarchy with a republic. The group was small, but Gaddafi was the driving force behind it, combining charisma with strict organizational discipline. After graduating from the military academy in 1965, he served in the Libyan army, but his primary focus remained political. He studied military tactics in the United Kingdom for a short time, but he was unimpressed with Western culture and considered it decadent. On September 1, 1969, at only 27 years old, Gaddafi and his fellow officers staged a bloodless coup against King Idris while the monarch was abroad receiving medical treatment. The coup succeeded quickly, and the Revolutionary Command Council, headed by Gaddafi, declared the abolition of the monarchy and the establishment of the Libyan Arab Republic. Gaddafi became the de facto leader of the country, although his official title at the beginning was chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council. From this moment, Gaddafi began reshaping Libya in his own vision. In the early years of his rule, Gaddafi introduced a number of reforms that won him support both domestically and abroad. He expelled foreign military bases from Libya, including those of the United States and the United Kingdom, which raised his standing among Arab nations. He nationalized banks, oil companies, and other foreign-owned assets, redirecting Libya's oil wealth towards social programs. Under his rule in the 1970s, Libya's literacy rate rose significantly as education was made free and widely accessible. Healthcare also became free, and housing projects expanded across the country. For many ordinary Libyans, these policies improved their standard of living compared to the years under King Idris. Gaddafi promoted what he called the Third International Theory, a political philosophy he presented in his famous Green Book, published in 3 parts between 1975 and 1979. In the Green Book, he rejected both capitalism and communism, calling them outdated systems. Instead, he advocated for a form of direct democracy where power would supposedly rest in the hands of the people through local popular committees. At the same time, he emphasized traditional tribal structures and Islamic values as a foundation for governance. In theory, this system promised equality, self-sufficiency, and freedom from Western domination. However, in practice, Gaddafi maintained tight control over the political system. The so-called popular committees and congresses were largely under his influence, and opposition was not tolerated. Dissent was suppressed by a combination of state security forces and revolutionary committees loyal to him. Political opponents were imprisoned, exiled, or killed. Gaddafi's regime developed a reputation for eliminating dissidents abroad as well, with assassinations of Libyan exiles reported in Europe and elsewhere. At the same time, Gaddafi positioned Libya as a leader in global revolutionary movements. He funded various liberation groups, from African anti-colonial fighters to radical organizations in Europe and the Middle East. His foreign policy often placed him at odds with Western powers, who accused him of sponsoring terrorism. Libya's name became linked to several violent incidents, including the 1986 Berlin discotheque bombing that killed 2 American soldiers and a Turkish woman. In response, the United States under President Ronald Reagan ordered airstrikes on Tripoli and Benghazi, targeting Gaddafi directly. The attack killed dozens of Libyans, including one of Gaddafi's adopted daughters, but he survived and used the event to bolster his image as a hero resisting imperialist aggression. Perhaps the most infamous international incident associated with Gaddafi's Libya was the 1988 Lockerbie bombing. A Pan Am flight exploded over the Scottish town of Lockerbie, killing 270 people. Western governments blamed Libyan agents for the attack, leading to years of sanctions and Libya's isolation from much of the world. Gaddafi denied direct involvement, but eventually, in the early 2000s, Libya agreed to pay compensation to the families of the victims, which many saw as an indirect admission of responsibility. Domestically, Gaddafi continued to present himself as a revolutionary figure. He avoided traditional state titles, instead adopting the informal title of brother leader and guide of the revolution. He emphasized his role not as a president but as a leader of the people's revolution. At times he appeared eccentric on the international stage, wearing flamboyant robes, setting up a Bedouin tent during foreign visits, and making long, fiery speeches at the United Nations and other gatherings. Despite his authoritarian rule, Gaddafi pursued certain initiatives that had positive effects in Libya and Africa. He invested heavily in infrastructure, most notably the Great Man-Made River Project, which sought to bring water from underground aquifers in the Sahara to Libya's coastal cities. This massive engineering project improved water supply in arid regions. He also used Libya's oil wealth to support African development, pushing for greater African unity and even proposing the creation of a single African currency and military force. By the 2000s, Gaddafi attempted to normalize relations with the West. After the September 11 attacks in the United States, he condemned terrorism and announced that Libya would abandon its weapons of mass destruction programs. This decision led to the lifting of many international sanctions and a brief period where Gaddafi was courted by Western leaders. Oil contracts flowed once again, and Libya's economy experienced growth. However, within Libya, political freedoms remained restricted, and opposition to his rule quietly simmered beneath the surface. By the time of the Arab Spring in 2011, Gaddafi had ruled Libya for more than 4 decades, making him one of the longest-serving leaders in the world. His rule combined both achievements and repression, leaving a mixed legacy that inspired loyalty in some and deep resentment in others. His downfall would soon come, as the winds of revolution spread across North Africa and the Middle East. After consolidating his rule during the 1970s, Muammar Gaddafi attempted to reshape Libya into what he described as a revolutionary state independent of Western domination and distinct from both communism and capitalism. His political philosophy was outlined in his Green Book, a collection of writings published between 1975 and 1979. In it he rejected parliamentary democracy, political parties, and traditional capitalism, presenting instead a system he called Jamahiriya, translated as state of the masses. Under this structure, he declared that Libya would be governed through popular committees and congresses, giving the impression of direct rule by the people, though in practice power remained firmly under his personal control. Economically, Gaddafi sought to use Libya's oil wealth to modernize the nation and elevate the standard of living. The state nationalized foreign oil companies, dramatically increasing revenues. These funds were used to finance ambitious infrastructure projects such as the Great Man-Made River, an enormous engineering project designed to transport water from underground aquifers in the desert to coastal cities and agricultural lands. While costly, it was considered one of the largest irrigation projects in history and remains a lasting part of his legacy. Education and healthcare were made free, literacy rates rose sharply, and Libyans enjoyed some of the highest living standards in Africa during the peak of oil wealth. However, economic management was inconsistent, and corruption, mismanagement, and lavish spending coexisted with real progress. Internationally, Gaddafi sought to position himself as a champion of Arab unity and African independence. In the early years he aligned closely with Egypt under President Gamal Abdel Nasser, admiring his vision of Pan-Arabism. Gaddafi attempted to merge Libya with Egypt and Sudan, but the plans failed due to political differences. Relations with neighboring Arab states were turbulent, as his outspoken style and attempts at unification often clashed with the realities of national sovereignty. After the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, Gaddafi became increasingly frustrated with Arab leaders whom he believed compromised with the West, and he gradually shifted his focus towards Africa. His Africa policy was both ambitious and controversial. Gaddafi invested heavily in the African Union, championing the idea of a United States of Africa with a single currency, army, and passport. He provided financial aid to many African nations, built mosques and universities, and presented himself as a defender of the continent against Western exploitation. In many parts of Africa, especially sub-Saharan regions, he was respected for this support. Yet critics argued that his financial generosity was often motivated by the desire to extend his influence rather than pure solidarity, and at home many Libyans questioned why so much national wealth was spent abroad. At the same time, Gaddafi's foreign policy drew condemnation from Western governments. He supported numerous revolutionary and insurgent groups worldwide, offering money, weapons, and training. Among these were the Irish Republican Army, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and various African liberation movements. His government was accused of involvement in international terrorism, including the 1986 Berlin discotheque bombing and most infamously the 1988 Lockerbie bombing that killed 270 people when Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over Scotland. These events brought Libya into direct confrontation with the United States and its allies. In April 1986, after the Berlin bombing, American warplanes bombed Tripoli and Benghazi in an attempt to target Gaddafi. He survived the attack, but his adopted daughter was killed, further fueling his hostility toward the United States. Through the late 1980s and 1990s, Libya endured increasing international isolation. The United Nations imposed sanctions over the Lockerbie case, crippling the Libyan economy. Oil exports were restricted, foreign investments declined, and ordinary Libyans faced shortages despite the country's vast resources. During this time Gaddafi's internal rule grew harsher. Political dissent was crushed through arrests, torture, and executions. Opposition figures abroad were targeted in what were called stray dog assassinations, where Libyan agents hunted defectors and critics in foreign countries. The regime cultivated a culture of fear, ensuring that no organized resistance could threaten his authority. Despite this repression, Gaddafi continued to cultivate an image of eccentricity and defiance. He frequently appeared in flamboyant uniforms, traditional robes, or elaborate costumes, and he delivered marathon speeches filled with fiery rhetoric. He rejected conventional diplomacy, preferring dramatic gestures, such as setting up his Bedouin-style tent when visiting foreign capitals. To his supporters, these behaviors symbolized his independence and refusal to bow to Western norms. To his critics, they reflected arrogance and detachment from reality. By the late 1990s, international pressure forced Gaddafi to make concessions. Libya eventually handed over suspects in the Lockerbie bombing and agreed to pay compensation to victims' families. In return, sanctions were gradually lifted. After the 2003 United States invasion of Iraq, Gaddafi sought to rehabilitate relations with the West, fearing that Libya could become the next target. He announced the abandonment of Libya's weapons of mass destruction programs and opened the country to international inspections. Western governments welcomed this move, and relations improved significantly. Oil companies returned, trade expanded, and Gaddafi received foreign leaders once again. For a time, it appeared he had successfully repositioned Libya from pariah state to strategic partner. Domestically, however, the contradictions of his rule deepened. While Libya remained relatively prosperous compared to many African states, wealth distribution was unequal, and corruption persisted at the highest levels of government. Gaddafi's family members were widely reported to control major sectors of the economy, enriching themselves through privileged access. Political institutions remained hollow, with the Jamahiriya system serving more as a facade for his authority than a real form of popular governance. Younger Libyans, increasingly exposed to the outside world through education and technology, grew restless under the decades-long dictatorship. The turning point came in 2011, when the wave of uprisings known as the Arab Spring swept across the Middle East and North Africa. Protests erupted in Libya, initially demanding political reforms and greater freedoms. Gaddafi responded with force, deploying the military and loyalist militias to crush demonstrations. His speeches denounced the protesters as traitors, rats, and agents of foreign powers. Violence escalated into civil war as opposition forces armed themselves and captured cities in the east. The international community intervened after reports of massacres and threats of large-scale killings. In March 2011, the United Nations authorized a no-fly zone over Libya, and NATO launched airstrikes against Gaddafi's forces. This intervention turned the tide of the conflict, allowing rebels to advance. For months Gaddafi clung to power, moving between strongholds and delivering defiant messages through radio and television, insisting he would die in Libya rather than surrender. By October 2011, rebel forces closed in on his hometown of Sirte, where he had taken refuge. On October 20th, he was captured while attempting to flee the city. Graphic footage showed him alive in the hands of his enemies, but moments later he was killed under chaotic circumstances. His body was displayed publicly in Misrata, drawing crowds of Libyans who wanted proof that his era had ended. He was eventually buried in a secret location to prevent his grave from becoming a rallying point. The death of Muammar Gaddafi marked the end of more than 4 decades of rule. To some he left behind achievements, such as expanded education, healthcare, and infrastructure that had transformed Libya from one of the poorest countries in Africa into one of the most developed. To others he left a legacy of repression, corruption, and brutality, symbolized by torture chambers, assassinations, and international terrorism. His dream of a United States of Africa never materialized, and Libya itself descended into instability and conflict after his fall. His rule remains one of the most controversial in modern history, both admired and condemned, remembered as a mixture of ambition, eccentricity, progress, and cruelty.